On the morning of March 18, 1915, an Anglo-French battle fleet entered the Dardanelles, a narrow 38-mile-long strait in northwestern Turkey, connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, dividing the Gallipoli Peninsula in Europe from the Asian mainland. It is along the Bosphorus and it links the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. It was an extraordinary concentration of naval power. British and French battleships advanced in successive lines toward the Narrows, the confined passage guarding the route to the Sea of Marmara and Constantinople. Their objective was simple to describe: silence the Ottoman guns, clear the minefields, force the strait. If the fleet reached Constantinople, the Ottoman government might collapse. The Ottoman Empire might leave the war. The sea route to Russia might reopen. It was supposed to be a decisive operation. It was also supposed to be a fairly inexpensive one. There would be no great army fighting its way across the peninsula. There would be no prolonged campaign. Naval power would do the work. The battleships opened fire. The Ottoman forts replied. For hours, smoke and spray obscured the strait. Heavy shells struck the fortifications on both banks. Some Ottoman batteries were damaged, others were temporarily silenced. Then, in the early afternoon, the French battleship Bouvet turned away from the firing line. There was an explosion beneath her. The ship rolled over and capsized within about 2 minutes. 639 of her crew were killed. At first, the cause was not obvious. The ship had been under Ottoman fire, but Bouvet had struck a mine in a line the Allies had not detected. 10 days earlier, on the night of March 8, the small Ottoman mine layer Nasret had entered Chunuk Bay. Ottoman observers had noticed that Allied battleships used the bay when turning away after their bombardments. Instead of laying another conventional mine barrier across the strait, Nasret placed a line of 26 mines parallel to the Asian shore. The mines waited where the battleships turned. Later that afternoon, HMS Irresistible from the British Royal Navy struck a mine and was abandoned. HMS Ocean, sent to assist her, was also mined. Both ships eventually sank. HMS Inflexible was badly damaged but escaped. 3 battleships had been lost in 1 day. Others had been damaged. The fleet withdrew. This is often told as the story of the 26 mines defeating an armada. That is close enough to the truth to be useful, but too simple to be complete. The Dardanelles were defended by more than 1 mine line. They were protected by fixed guns, mobile howitzers, searchlights, observation posts, and hundreds of mines. The mobile batteries made minesweeping under fire extremely difficult. The mines did not operate alone. They were part of a defensive system. Within that defensive system, the undetected line laid by Nasret proved decisive. The great guns could be seen. The forts could be mapped. The mines could not. By the end of March 18th, the commanders of the fleet had concluded that the strait could not be forced under the existing conditions. The attempt by battleships alone was suspended. The original plan had not failed after a long campaign. It had failed in an afternoon. The land campaign that followed would last more than 8 months. It would involve hundreds of thousands of men. It would produce enormous losses on both sides, and it would never place an Allied battleship in the Sea of Marmara. The British and French had set out to take an empire's capital from the sea. They had announced their arrival within weeks of bombardment. And at the decisive moment, they were stopped by mines laid in the dark by a 365-ton Ottoman mine layer. I am Benito and welcome to the Jacked Historian channel. This is Gallipoli. But first, let's look at some background information. Where did this campaign come from? This is not a story about a peninsula. It is a story about a deadlock and a shortcut men convinced themselves existed. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had hardened. The mobile campaigns of August and September had ended. From the English Channel to Switzerland, armies occupied trenches protected by artillery, machine guns, and barbed wire. There was no open flank left to turn. Every attempted breakthrough threatened to become another frontal assault against prepared positions. Britain and France needed alternatives. The Ottoman Empire appeared to offer one. The empire had suffered severe territorial losses before the war. Italy had taken Ottoman territory in North Africa. The Balkan Wars had driven Ottoman power out of much of southeastern Europe. And European statements had spent decades describing the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe. That description encouraged a dangerous assumption. A state that had lost territory was assumed to be incapable of defending what remained. The Ottoman government secretly allied itself with Germany in August 1914. On October 29th, Ottoman warships attacked Russian ports in the Black Sea. Russia declared war on November 2nd. Britain and France followed. The Ottoman entry transformed the strategic geography of the war. The Dardanelles and the Bosphorus controlled the maritime route between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. With the straits closed, Russia was separated from its western allies by sea. Russia still possessed northern ports, but they were constrained by distance, climate, and capacity. The direct warm water route through these straits was blocked. There were other considerations. An attack on the Ottoman Empire might relieve pressure on Russia. It might encourage Balkan states to join the Allies. It might also threaten Constantinople and remove an entire member of the Central Powers from the war. It might also protect British interests in Egypt and the Suez Canal. Most appealing of all, it offered the possibility of action somewhere other than France and Belgium. The Western Front was devouring men. The Dardanelles appeared to promise decision by maneuver. Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, became the plan's most energetic political advocate. Churchill did not invent British interest in the Dardanelles. The strategic importance of the Straits was obvious, and different forms of attack were discussed within the British government. Nor did Churchill possess the authority to begin the campaign by himself. Major operations required approval from the War Council and the participation of military and naval leaders. But Churchill pushed hard. He believed that British sea power could be used actively. The Royal Navy represented an enormous concentration of national strength. A number of older battleships could be employed in the Eastern Mediterranean without weakening the Grand Fleet's confrontation with Germany in the North Sea. These ships were not expendable in the literal sense, but they carried trained crews, heavy guns, and years of accumulated investment. They were more expendable than Britain's modern dreadnoughts. The plan gathered support because it promised a large strategic return from forces that seemed available. That was the attraction of the plan. There was no guarantee that bombarding the forts would produce Ottoman surrender. There was no guarantee that the Balkan states would enter the war. There was no guarantee that forcing the strait would solve Russia's supply problems, and no guarantee that Allied fleets off Constantinople would compel the Ottoman government to capitulate rather than relocate and continue fighting. Each step depended on the previous one. Each uncertain result was treated as the foundation for the next. The campaign began, therefore, not with madness, but with optimism. That distinction matters. The Dardanelles operation was not an obvious impossible idea assembled by fools. Its strategic rewards were real enough to tempt serious men. The problem was that the widening distance between what success might offer and what chosen forces could actually accomplish. The plan assumed that naval gunfire could destroy a defensive system composed of forts, mobile artillery, minefields, and concealed positions. It assumed civilian crewed minesweepers could clear mines while under fire. It assumed that Ottoman political resistance would weaken as the fleet advanced. And beneath all of this sat the oldest assumption of the campaign: the Ottomans would not stand. The disaster began with a shortcut. It began with the belief that a tired empire could be knocked over without paying the cost of knocking it over. But let's see what was the objective, what both sides wanted. The geography was simple and unforgiving. As I mentioned earlier, the Dardanelles is a narrow waterway connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara. Beyond the Sea of Marmara lies the Bosphorus, and beyond the Bosphorus lies the Black Sea. The Gallipoli Peninsula forms the European side of the Dardanelles. The Asian shore lies opposite. A fleet attempting to pass through the strait had to overcome defenses on both banks. And they also had to pass minefields in confined water while exposed to artillery. The Allied objective was to force that passage. First, the outer force would be destroyed. Then the minefields would be swept. Then the fleet would advance through the Narrows and into the Sea of Marmara. Once there, it could threaten Constantinople, attack communications, support Russian operations, and perhaps compel the Ottoman government to seek peace. The initial scheme was naval. That point is essential. The army was not originally intended to fight a major campaign across Gallipoli. A limited number of troops might be needed to occupy destroyed positions or assist the fleet, but the warships were expected to produce the strategic result. When the naval operation failed, the objective did not change. The means changed. An army would land on Gallipoli, capture the ground controlling the strait, and eliminate the batteries obstructing the fleet. The navy could then resume its advance. The army was being asked to repair the failure of the naval plan. It was not being given an independent objective that could be reached without the fleet. On the Ottoman side, the objective was more direct: hold the strait. The Dardanelles protected the capital. If Allied warships entered the Sea of Marmara, the consequences could be grave, even if the Ottoman government did not immediately surrender. The defenders, therefore, had to stop the fleet, preserve the minefields, and prevent Allied troops from capturing the high ground and coastal defenses. Once that landing came, the peninsula itself became the battlefield. The Ottoman defenders did not need to throw the Allies into the sea on the first morning. That would have been desirable, but it was not necessary. They needed to keep the invaders away from the decisive ground. They needed to contain each beachhead. They needed to prevent the Allies from turning a landing into a breakthrough. The attacker was operating across the sea, dependent on beaches, piers, boats, and exposed supply routes. The defender could move reinforcement by land and use the peninsula's ridges to observe the cramped Allied positions. Time favored the Ottomans. Every day that the fleet remained outside the strait was an Ottoman success. Every day the Allied army remained on the beach was an Allied failure. The Allies needed movement. The Ottomans needed to deny it. That was the campaign reduced to one question: could the invaders get off the beaches before the defenders closed the ground above them? The answer would be no. And from here we'll go and take a look at the plan. The naval operation began in earnest on February 19, 1915. British and French warships bombarded the outer forts near the entrance to the Dardanelles. The early results appeared promising. The heavy naval guns could engage fixed fortifications from beyond the effective range of some Ottoman weapons. But you see, destroying a fort was not the same as hitting it. Earth, masonry, and armor could absorb punishment. Gun crews could take shelter and return after a bombardment. Mobile howitzers could relocate. Ammunition could be dispersed. Damage visible from a ship did not necessarily mean a position that had been permanently neutralized. The fleet could suppress batteries. It had far more difficulty proving that they would remain suppressed. The deeper minefields created the real operational problem. The primary British minesweepers were converted civilian trawlers. Many were operated by civilian crews. Their work required them to enter confined water at night, locate mines, cut their mooring cables, and destroy them. They had to do this under fire. Mobile Ottoman guns on the shore could engage the minesweepers while remaining difficult for the battleships to locate. The trawlers lacked speed and protection, and many of the civilian crews had not been trained to clear mines under sustained artillery fire. Repeated sweeping attempts failed to open a safe channel. Logic of the operation now began to close in on itself. The fleet could not advance until the mines were cleared. The mines could not be cleared while the mobile guns remained active. The mobile guns were difficult to destroy from ships. Ground troops were needed to eliminate them. But the naval plan had been approved partly because a large ground force was not available. The attempt on March 18th was meant to break that deadlock through concentrated force. Instead, it exposed it. After the loss of the French ship Bouvet and the British Irresistible and Ocean, the fleet commander, acting Vice Admiral John de Robec, did not resume the major assault. This decision has produced more than a century of argument. Some have claimed that the Ottoman defenses were close to exhaustion and that one more naval attack might have succeeded. Others argue that the central problem remained unresolved. The Allied fleet still lacked a swept channel. The mine threat had not been mastered, and the ships remained exposed to guns and unseen obstacles. The honest answer is that the result of another attack cannot be known. A renewed attempt might have forced the strait. It may also have lost more battleships without clearing the minefields. Counterfactual certainty is not history. What can be established is that the naval command decided not to continue under the same conditions, and British planners turned to a major landing. On March 12, before the decisive naval attack, General Sir Ian Hamilton had already been appointed to command the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. His available formation eventually included the British 29th Division, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Royal Naval Division, the French Oriental Expeditionary Corps, and Indian troops. This was a substantial force. It was not a force prepared for the task it received. Hamilton had little time to plan. Intelligence on the peninsula was incomplete. Maps were inadequate. Specialized landing craft were scarce. Many troops had no experience in amphibious warfare. Units and supplies had not been loaded in the order needed for a contested landing. Some transports had to return to Egypt so their cargoes could be reorganized. This consumed time. Time was precisely what the operation could not afford to give away. The naval bombardments had already identified the Dardanelles as the target. After March 18th, a landing on or near Gallipoli was an obvious possibility. The Ottomans used the interval to strengthen the peninsula's defenses. In late March, the newly organized Fifth Army was placed under the German General Otto Liman von Sanders. The landings were scheduled for April 25th. At Cape Helles, on the southern tip of the peninsula, the British 29th Division would land on several beaches. Its first major objectives included the village of Kritia and the high ground of Achi Baba. The French would stage a diversion on the Asian shore of Kum Kale before joining the Helles front. Farther north, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps would land near Gaba Tepe. It would advance inland toward the high ground, threaten Ottoman communications, and help isolate the southern defenses. The landings were dispersed. That created several points of pressure, but it also divided the Allied combat power. The plan depended on the troops advancing quickly before Ottoman reserves could intervene. Speed was not a desirable addition to the plan. Speed was the plan. The Allies had spent weeks demonstrating where they intended to attack. They now depended on achieving tactical surprise at the place where strategic surprise no longer existed. The land campaign was a patch placed over a failed naval operation. It was improvised, it was rushed, and it was launched against the enemy, an enemy that had been given time to prepare. And here we start seeing the cracks of the intelligence failure. But before examining what happened on April 25th, it is necessary to remove one comforting explanation. The Allies did not fail because Gallipoli was physically impossible to invade. Men did get ashore. At several beaches, they established positions under fire. At others, they encountered limited initial opposition. The failure was not that the sea rejected them. The failure was that the operation had been built around assumptions that did not survive contact with the coast. The first assumption concerned the enemy. Allied assessments were shaped by the Ottoman Empire's recent defeats, by imperial prejudice, and by a persistent belief that Ottoman resistance would collapse under a sufficient powerful attack. The Ottoman army had serious weaknesses. It suffered from shortages, uneven training, political interference, and poor communications. But a force can possess weaknesses and still fight effectively. The Ottomans were defending ground near the capital. Their troops had undergone hard experience in the Balkan Wars. Their commanders understood the importance of the peninsula. Their defensive preparations combined minefields, artillery, reserves, and the interior ridgelines. The Allied plan required the Ottomans to react slowly. The Ottomans did not always cooperate. The second assumption concerned the ground. From the sea, Gallipoli could appear bare and open. On land, much of the peninsula was cut by ravines, spurs, gullies, scrub, and abrupt ridges. A position a short distance away on a map could require a difficult climb across terrain that broke formations apart. Officers could lose contact with neighboring units. Men could advance without knowing whether their flanks were secure. The high ground dominated everything. Whoever held the ridges could observe the beaches and the routes leading inland. The attackers had to climb toward those positions. The defenders could move along and behind them. The Allies possessed maps, aerial reconnaissance, naval observation, and reports. What they lacked was an adequate operational understanding of how the terrain would control movement once thousands of men came ashore. They, of course, knew where the peninsula was, but they did not know it well enough to fight across it at speed. At Cape Helles, the 29th Division landed across 5 principal beaches. The experiences differed sharply. At V Beach, near the Said El Bahr, the converted collier River Clyde was deliberately grounded. Openings had been cut into the ship's hull. Troops were intended to emerge onto gangways, cross a bridge of smaller vessels, and move directly onto the shore. The construction looked ingenious. Under fire, it became a total trap. Ottoman defenders poured rifle and machine gun fire into the men attempting to leave the ship. The improvised bridge broke down. Soldiers were exposed while moving through narrow exits and across open water. The survivors remained on board until darkness allowed more of them to reach ashore. At W Beach, British troops also encountered fierce resistance and suffered heavily. At other landing points, the opposition was initially much lighter. That uneven resistance created opportunities, but it also created confusion. Local commanders did not always know what was happening on adjacent beaches. Units became mixed, communications were unreliable, the urgency of the original timetable disappeared into the immediate work of surviving, reorganizing, and bringing supplies ashore. By nightfall, the British possessed beachheads at Helles. They had not taken Achibaba, they had not taken Kritia. They had not achieved the rapid inland advance upon which the operation depended. The Anzac landing created a different problem. The first boats came ashore before dawn in the area now known as Anzac Cove, north of the beach commonly identified in the operational plan. The troops did not find a gentle route inland. They found steep slopes, tangled gullies, and broken bridges. The fact of the northern landing is clear. Its cause it is not. Older accounts often blamed an unexpected current. Later historians have proposed navigational error, confusion among the towing formations, unclear instructions, or some combination of those factors. A recent scholarly examination argues that the naval force was already positioned too far north before the landing began. Other historians have questioned how precisely the original landing point had been defined or whether the eventual location was entirely accidental. The cause remains disputed. There is no need to solve the dispute to understand its result. The men came ashore beneath difficult ground. Their units became separated as they climbed through gullies and over spurs. Some groups penetrated inland, others drifted north or south. Officers struggled to determine their positions. The landing had achieved surprise. It had not produced organized momentum. This is one of the great distinctions in amphibious warfare. Landing is not the same as breaking out. A beachhead keeps an army alive. A breakthrough allows it to accomplish its mission. By the afternoon of April 25th, the Anzac force had men on the peninsula, supplies coming ashore, and warships offshore providing support. It did not control the decisive heights of the Chunuk Bair range. The Allied failure of intelligence was not one missing report or one defective map, it was cumulative. The Ottoman army was assumed to be brittle. The terrain was treated as an obstacle that determination could overcome. The naval bombardment was assumed to have produced more lasting destruction than it had. The defenders' ability to concentrate reserves was discounted. The attackers landed on ground they did not adequately understand against an enemy they had not adequately respected after giving the enemy weeks to prepare. The beaches did not defeat them. What waited above the beaches did. And here we'll see the command failure clearly. A bad plan does not remove responsibility from the men who execute it. It makes command more important. At Gallipoli, command was fragmented by distance, poor communications, divided authority, and temperament. Hamilton watched the initial operations from offshore. During the opening phase, his headquarters operated aboard the converted liner Arcadian. General headquarters was subsequently established on Imbros. These arrangements maintained access to the fleet and the expedition's communications. They also separated the commander from the ground he was directing. Reports arrived late or incomplete. The situation visible from offshore was not the situation experienced in the ravines. Hamilton was often reluctant to remove or overrule subordinate commanders until opportunities had passed. The fleet and army also remained distinct institutions with different chains of command. The campaign depended on precise cooperation between them, but no single commander possessed complete control over both. The operation was called combined. The command system remained divided. At Helles, the failure was not that every formation refused to advance. Men fought, climbed, and died across ground that offered little protection. The failure was that limited local opportunities did not become a coordinated drive inland. Some troops came ashore against little immediate opposition, but units had separate beach objectives. Communications were weak, and commanders were uncertain about the wider situation. By the time sufficient force was organized, Ottoman resistance had strengthened. The first day ended with Allies holding the beaches. The defenders still held the heights and the principal routes inland. At Anzac, the position was still more precarious. Small groups had advanced toward the ridges, but unity, cohesion had broken down. Ottoman counterattacks threatened to push the disordered landing force back. Senior ANZAC commanders considered evacuation on the first night, but Hamilton rejected it. His reply was in substance that there was nothing to do but dig in and hold. The decision prevented immediate defeat. It also described what the campaign was about to become. The Allied positions hardened. At Helles, repeated attacks attempted to take Krithia and Achibaba. The first Battle of Krithia failed. The second failed. The third failed. The gains were measured in limited pieces of ground. The casualties accumulated. At Anzac, the beachhead remained cramped beneath the ridges. The opposing trench system drew close together. Bombs were thrown from one position into another. Snipers watched exposed routes. Every container of water, every shell, every ration, and every reinforcement had to cross the beaches. The campaign had been designed to escape trench warfare. It recreated exactly trench warfare on a peninsula with fewer roads, less water, and almost no depth behind the front. Summer, of course, made the conditions worse. Heat accelerated decomposition. Flies moved between corpses, latrines, and food. Dysentery spread through the camps. Clean water was scarce. Men weakened before they entered battle. Illness became a central part of the casualty list. Disease removed more British personnel from service than battle did. Of roughly 213,000 recorded British casualties, about 145,000 were attributed to illness. A disaster. The ground itself concentrated the problem. There was little room to remove men from the battlefield environment. The front line, supply areas, hospitals, and beaches existed within a narrow space under observation. The army had not escaped the Western Front. It had constructed a smaller and less sanitary version of it. By the summer of 1915, the campaign had reached a strategic deadlock. The fleet had not forced the strait. The army had not captured the peninsula. But withdrawal would mean admitting that the entire operation had failed. Instead, the Allies prepared another offensive. The August offensive was larger, more complicated, and potentially decisive. It also repeated the central error of April. It produced an opportunity, then it gave the defender time to close it. The plan required several operations to work together. Australian troops would attack at Lone Pine as a diversion. Other attacks would hold Ottoman forces around the Anzac perimeter and at Helles. Columns from Anzac would move through difficult country and capture the heights of the Sari Bair range, including Chunuk Bair and Hill 971. At the same time, fresh British formations would land at Suvla Bay, north of Anzac. They would secure the surrounding ground, advance inland, and support the drive on Sari Bair. The plan depended on speed, coordination, and night movement across terrain the Allies had already found difficult to master. It began on August 6 at Lone Pine. Australian troops captured Ottoman positions after brutal close fighting. The diversion achieved a local success at very high cost. Elsewhere, the machinery came apart. Columns became delayed and disoriented in the darkness. Timetables slipped. Units arrived at objectives exhausted or incomplete. Attacks intended to support one another occurred separately. At the Neck, on August 7th, Australian light horsemen attacked across a narrow strip of exposed ground against prepared Ottoman positions. The preliminary bombardment ended several minutes before the assault began. In that pause, the defenders returned to their trenches. Wave after wave went forward. In approximately 15 minutes, the Australians suffered 372 casualties, including 234 dead. The attack accomplished nothing. The New Zealanders reached Chunuk Bay. Before dawn on August 8, the Wellington Battalion reached the forward crest of Chunuk Bair. From there, Allied soldiers could see the waters of the Dardanelles, the passage the entire campaign had been launched to open. They could not hold it. Ottoman fire swept the exposed positions. Reinforcements arrived unevenly. The Wellington battalion was devastated. When it was relieved, only a fraction of its original strength remained standing. British units replaced the New Zealanders. On August 10th, an Ottoman counterattack drove them from the height. Chunuk Bair had been reached. It had not been secured. At Suvla, meanwhile, the Allies briefly obtained what they had lacked in April: a relatively lightly opposed landing. Fresh formations came ashore. The immediate Ottoman forces were limited. The high ground beyond the bay was not yet held in overwhelming strength. This was the opportunity. The commander at Suvla was Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stopford. He was an older officer with limited recent field command experience. His orders and Hamilton's expectations were not translated into an immediate forceful advance. Stopford focused on consolidating the landing and securing water. Water was a genuine necessity. Units landing at Suvla were disorganized. Many men were exhausted, and the terrain was confusing. The notion that the entire corps simply stopped for tea is caricature, not explanation. But the operational fact remains. The advance did not move with the urgency demanded by the plan. The commanding heights beyond the beachhead were not secured before the Ottoman command could reinforce them. Liman von Sanders moved reinforcement towards Suvla. Ottoman troops reached the threatened ground. By the time British attacks resumed in strength, the window had closed. Stopford was removed from command on August 15th. Removing him did not restore the lost hours. This was the second failure. April could be explained by inexperience, defective reconnaissance, confused landings, and the shock of first contact. August could not. By August, the Allied command knew the importance of the ridges. It knew that Ottoman reserves could move toward a threatened landing. It knew that a beachhead without the high ground could become another trap. It knew that every hour mattered. The landing at Suvla still lost momentum. The same mistake had been made twice, months apart. In April, the defenders received the time required to contain the beachhead. In August, they were given it again. After the August offensive, there was no credible path to victory with the forces already on the peninsula. Hamilton continued to resist evacuation. He believed withdrawal could produce catastrophic losses and still hoped that additional troops might permit another attempt. The British government had lost confidence. In October, Hamilton was recalled. His replacement, General Sir Charles Monro, inspected the position and recommended evacuation. The campaign had reached the point at which the only achievable objective was to save the army sent to achieve the original one. But let's take a look at the enemy, because up to this point, the Gallipoli story can sound like a sequence of Allied errors. That may be misleading. The Allies did not lose only because their plans were defective. The Ottoman forces won because they recognized opportunities, moved troops, endured bombardment, and held decisive ground. The defense of the Dardanelles involved both Ottoman and German officers, but it was overwhelmingly Ottoman soldiers who fought and died on the peninsula. Before the landings, the coastal defenses had already demonstrated their effectiveness. Cevat Pasha's command combined fixed batteries, mobile guns, and minefields. This integrated system prevented the Allied fleet from separating the mine problem from the artillery problem. The land defenses came under Ottoman Fifth Army, commanded by Liman von Sanders. Liman's dispositions had been criticized. He expected possible landings at several points and kept significant forces in reserve rather than concentrating every unit directly on the beaches. Some Ottoman officers disagreed with aspects of his plan, but the reserve system gave the defenders flexibility. Ottoman units did not need to defend every meter of coastline in equal strength. They needed to delay landings long enough for reserves to reach the decisive ground. At Helles, small forces imposed delay and heavy losses at several beaches. At Anzac, the decisive response came from the commander of the Ottoman 19th Division, Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa. On the morning of April 25th, Kemal receives reports of the landing. His division formed part of the reserve. He was not supposed to commit it casually. Kemal understood which ground mattered. If the invaders secured the commanding heights of the Sari Bair range, the Ottoman position on the peninsula could become untenable. He moved toward the sound of the fighting with elements of his division rather than waiting for the situation to become fully clear. Near the heights, he encountered Ottoman soldiers withdrawing after exhausting their ammunition. Kemal ordered them to stop and fix bayonets. That pause helped check the Ally advance while reinforcements approached. He then committed the 57th Regiment to the counter-attack. In his later account, Kemal attributed to himself an order that has become one of the most famous statements in Turkish military history. The precise wording cannot be treated as a verbatim battlefield recording. He is said to have told the 57th Regiment, "I do not order you to attack, I order you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places." What is not in doubt is the substance of his decision. He demanded that the regiment hold the ground at extreme cost until additional Ottoman forces arrived. The Ottoman counterattacks did not sweep the Anzac force back into the sea. They did something strategically sufficient. They prevented it from securing the heights. By nightfall, the Anzac troops held a precarious perimeter below the ridges. From there, they could survive, fight, and launch further attacks. They could not perform the role assigned to them in the campaign plan. Kemal's importance did not end on April 25th. During the August offensive, he assumed command of forces defending the threatened Sari Bair sector. On August 10, the Ottoman counterattack at Chunuk Bair drove the British from the summit and restored control of the key height. Again, the timing mattered. Again, the defenders struck before the Allies could consolidate their limited success. Kemal did not single-handedly win Gallipoli. That claim would erase the roles of Sevat Pasha, Esat Pasha, Liman von Sanders, other Ottoman commanders, German advisors, and the soldiers who carried out the defense. It would also turn a campaign into a biography. But Kemal repeatedly understood which ground mattered and acted at moments when delay would have been dangerous. His later career can make his role in 1915 appear preordained, but it was not. In 1915, he was not yet the Ataturk. He was an Ottoman lieutenant colonel who made effective decisions in a campaign where senior Allied commanders repeatedly failed to make theirs quickly enough. That is enough. The Ottoman soldiers who carried out these operations are often compressed into the figure of Mehmet, the common name used to represent the ordinary soldiers. They fought under severe conditions. Ottoman supply and medical systems were under immense pressure. The defenders suffered from disease, shortages, inadequate medical support, and enormous casualties. They attacked across exposed ground against naval gunfire, artillery rifles, and machine guns. On May 19, an Ottoman mass attack against the Anzac position failed with devastating losses. More than 3,000 Ottoman soldiers were reportedly killed. A temporary truce was arranged on May 24th to recover and bury the dead between the lines. The defense was competent. It was not bloodless. Nor did Ottoman command always avoid the same frontal attacks that characterized the wider war. That is why Gallipoli should not be reduced to a morality play in which one side was foolish and the other infallible. The Ottoman army made mistakes. It also accomplished its mission. It prevented the fleet from passing, it contained the landings, retook threatened heights. It absorbed losses without permitting an Allied breakthrough. The Allies had expected Ottoman weakness to be the fixed point around which the plan could operate. Instead, Ottoman resistance became the fixed point upon which the entire operation broke. Gallipoli was not lost to weather. It was not lost to one navigational error. It was not lost to one incompetent commander. And it was not lost because the peninsula possessed some mystical power to defeat invaders. It was won deliberately and at a terrible cost by an army the Allied planners had underestimated before the operation began. What did this create? What was the final reckoning? The evacuation was the one major operation at Gallipoli that worked almost exactly as intended. That was because it was approached differently. The planners treated the enemy seriously. They allowed time for preparation, they coordinated movements, deception, shipping, and logistics. They did not assume success would occur because the opponent was weak. They built the operation around what the opponent might do if he discovered it. The withdrawal from Anzac and Suvla began in stages in December 1915. The number of men in the forward positions was gradually reduced. Units altered their patterns of fire so the Ottomans would not immediately notice the declining strength. Equipment was removed at night. Stores that could not be taken were destroyed or left behind. Some rifles were fitted with mechanical delays. The best-known device used water dripping from one container into another. When the lower container became heavy enough, it pulled a string attached to the trigger and fired the weapon after its owner had departed. The devices did not win the evacuation by themselves. The broader deception did. Ottoman observers saw enough activity to believe their positions remained occupied. The final troops left Anzac and Suvla during the night of December 19th and December 20th. Helles remained occupied for several more weeks. Its final evacuation was completed during the night of January 8 and January 9, 1916. This does not mean the campaign ended without casualties. It means that the act of leaving, once carefully planned, caused less men to die, less casualties. The nearest Gallipoli came to a flawless operation was the act of leaving. Different sources count casualties in different categories. Some include only men killed and wounded. Others include prisoners, missing personnel, and the enormous number removed because of disease. Ottoman records present additional difficulties, and later national accounts do not always use the same method. Exact totals depend on what each source counts, but the scale is not in doubt. The Allies suffered more than 200,000 battle and non-battle casualties, with some estimates reaching approximately 250,000 or higher depending on what is included. Ottoman losses were comparable and may also have approached or exceeded 250,000 when wounded and sick are included. Deaths were counted in the tens of thousands on each side. No single neat figure should be presented as undisputed. The strategic result was clear. The Allied fleet did not force the Dardanelles. Constantinople was not captured. The sea route to Russia was not reopened. The Ottoman Empire did not leave the war. No decisive Balkan realignment followed from an Allied victory because there was no Allied victory. The troops, ships, artillery, ammunition, and political attention committed to Gallipoli had purchased no permanent territorial gain. The Ottoman Empire remained in the war until 1918. Whether a successful Dardanelles operation would have shortened the First World War cannot be established. It may have strengthened Russia. It may have changed the calculations of Greece, Bulgaria, or Romania. It might have destabilized the Ottoman government. It might also have produced another long campaign around Constantinople, creating new logistical demands, or failed to prevent Russia's internal collapse. The strategic promise was real. The promised result was never tested because the Allies never passed the strait. The counterfactual remains a possibility, not a conclusion. The campaign's political consequences began before the last soldier left. Admiral Sir John Fisher resigned as First Sea Lord in May 1915 after repeated disagreements with Churchill and amid the expansion of the Dardanelles commitment. The crisis contributed to the end of H. Asquith's Liberal government and the formation of a coalition in which Asquith remained Prime Minister. Churchill was removed from the Admiralty. He remained briefly in government in the lesser position of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, then resigned and served for a time with a battalion on the Western Front. Gallipoli damaged his reputation for decades. It did not permanently destroy his career. Hamilton never again received an active field command. Stopford had already been removed after Suvla. The British government eventually established the Dardanelles Commission to investigate the campaign's origin and conduct. The commission documented failures of preparation, supply coordination, and high-level decision-making, although its conclusions were widely regarded as mild. The failure had been collective. Churchill carries the campaign in popular memory because he advocated it with exceptional force. He deserves a substantial share of responsibility, but he did not approve, plan, or execute the operation alone. The War Council, Kitchener, the Admiralty, the naval commanders, Hamilton, and the commanders ashore all made decisions that shaped the result. Gallipoli was not one man's failure. It was a failure distributed across institutions that never established unified control over the operation. Responsibility was shared. That does not mean responsibility disappears. It means there was enough to go around. Gallipoli's military outcome was an Ottoman victory. Its memory became something larger and more complicated. For Australia and New Zealand, April 25th became Anzac Day. The landing entered national memory as a defining experience. It was a defeat remembering not because for failed strategy, but for endurance, sacrifice, and a developing national identity separate from Britain. The memory could be romanticized. It could also conceal other participants. British, Irish, French, Indian, Newfoundland, North African, and other troops fought in the campaign. The Gallipoli army was larger and more diverse than the later Anzac legend sometimes suggests. For New Zealand, the losses were particularly severe relative to the number of men sent. For Australia, the campaign became a foundational story despite the country having existed as a federation since 1901. A country was not literally born at Gallipoli. A national mythology was. In Turkey, the campaign became, pardon for my pronunciation, Çanakkale. The victory demonstrated that the Ottoman Empire was not incapable of defeating a major Allied operation. It became a story of national defense and sacrifice. It also elevated Mustafa Kemal. 8 years later, the Republic of Turkey was established and Kemal became its first president. He later received the surname of Ataturk. Gallipoli did not create him by itself. The Ottoman Empire still collapsed after the war. The Turkish War of Independence, political organization, military victories after 1918, and the abolition of the Sultanate all stood between the officer at Chunuk Bair and the president of a republic. But Gallipoli established his military reputation. The commander who recognized the importance of the ridge in 1915 became central to the state and emerged from the empire's defeat. This is the final paradox. The Allied powers came to Gallipoli seeking a shortcut to victory. They found a campaign longer, more expensive, and more complicated than the one they had imagined. They began with naval certainty. They continued with an improvised army. They landed without sufficient knowledge of the ground. They repeatedly allowed local surprise to expire before it could become strategic success. They blamed individuals for failures produced by institutions. And when they finally accepted that the operation could not succeed, they planned their departure with the patience and realism they had withheld from the invasion. The Dardanelles remained closed. The Ottoman Empire remained beyond the fleet's reach. The soldiers left behind cemeteries, wreckage, empty trenches, and names that would become part of three national traditions. The campaign failed to achieve its military objective. It succeeded in creating memory. The men who set out to take a capital by sea gave Australia and New Zealand Anzac Day. They gave Mustafa Kemal the battlefield on which his reputation was made, and they left one final lesson. The enemy does not become weak because the plan requires him to be weak. Ground does not become simple because the maps make it look simple. An opportunity does not remain open while commanders decide whether to use it. And a shortcut through a war is still part of the war. At Gallipoli, the Allies discovered each of these facts separately. They pay for all of them together. Well, this is it for this episode. Thank you very much for sticking until the end, and I will see you next time. Bye.